Live. Woo.
Yay. Okay.
With the lovely disclaimer we always have, because every week we do this, and every week I don't want anyone suing us.
That would be nice. That would be very nice.
Exactly. So today we are going to be discussing. I didn't even really tell you what we were doing. I think I just was like, it's about costly mistakes, and if you have any stories, let's talk.
For
And I
sure.
have a bunch of stories, but um,
Yeah.
yeah, I was trying to. I actually have old slides I had to pull up to like remember some of the stupid shit that I've done, and
Oh,
some of it is pretty bad stuff. I think one of the best was um, I remember a time I was chilling at home on the weekend, and just like everything stopped working in one of the data pipelines, and I don't even remember how I figured it out. I think it was just like Postgres issues. And I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you, but you ever been in a scenario where you have like a primary ID that's set to like an int, and then you exceed said int and it's auto
oh.
increment?
Oh God. I
This,
haven't. Yeah, that sounds like a disaster.
yeah, because this is worse because you're in a scenario of like panic, everything stopped, and you're like, oh, we can fix it. We just need to alter the table. But it's like total table lock, and the operation, and especially for that version, you couldn't do it without like the table lock the entire time. And I remember my manager at the time coming in. It was on a weekend, and he had to drive like an hour in from his house, and we came up with like some ultra hack SQL stuff of like, we're going to move everything to like a different table,
Mhm.
and that table is going to be for any integer or any primary ID starting from this point on. And anything that's before that, like, great, it's going to be the old table. And then we're going to backfill from the old table into the new table. And
Oh,
when that's
cool.
done, we'll like just switch over. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that I've been that situation. I think at least I've experienced it a few times where you have this like, hold on, this is the database as it exists. We can't do something for whatever the reason might be, or we can't mutate something, or something has changed. We need to just temporarily kind of set something up on the side. And now you have this code flow that's like read from one side, write to the other, or like when you read, then rewrite it here. And there's literally a person who is now the authority on like which element in which row is the truth between these two. You probably aged like 10 years over the weekend with those.
Oh, and there's really good like lessons that came out of it, which was
Mhm.
like, okay, you need to monitor anything that has a limit. And this was the worst because it's things that you don't think of.
Oh yeah.
Like I didn't design that system. I inherited that team in
Mhm.
that circumstance. And at that time, whoever implemented it was probably like, oh, we'll never hit that limit. Like, like we're so far from that. And jokes on them, hit that, and then it seemed like a sensible limit at that time. But once there was adoption of the like that system and whatnot, like it was very quickly achieved. Um, Go
Those.
ahead.
So the thing you just mentioned now, the like limit being hit, I've experienced at least two bugs before where the dates that we used were hard coded in these unit tests. And the dev was like, there's no way this is going to run for 5 years or 10 years or however long it's going to run. And the date's hard coded. And there was some logic in the one case, it was checking whether this person's ID or the ID of the user provided was older than 18 to have a certain action take place. And the account was like, let's set it up for like a 13-year-old. And 5 years later, the tests start failing and no one's changed the code. And everyone's like, what the hell's going on? I can't commit. And that's because our test account had become an adult. And the age associated was no longer failing the greater than 18 check. And I can see how at the time, like everyone who reviewed that, everyone who wrote the code was like, let's just make it like some arbitrary date will be fine. Not let's set the date to like today minus however.
Oh yeah.
And like any hard-coded values like that, they're all over the place. When you find out like, oh, there's this thing happened really funny, then you're like, what is going to happen with the other dates we have hard-coded? So
Do you know what I'm scared of?
not
Year
Y2K.
2038.
There we go. So that's the real Y2K. If people don't know that one, they're in for a surprise. That's going to be.
There are plenty of, almost probably every single system I've worked on has made some assumption that, look, this business won't be operating in 2038 or I fucking won't be here. Like,
yeah, no, I'm hopeful that will mostly, like when Y2 came around, Y2K's issue was like, it's going to be an operating system level, we're all screwed. Now with like the lack of representing the dates with insufficient bits is going to be everywhere, like application level, BIOS level, everything. So there, I don't know what's going to happen, but that's not really a coding mistake as much as it is like I don't know, planning for computers to be around for many hundred years.
It actually reminds me of, what was it? Other issues where assumptions that like you're only going to be dealing with IPv4.
Oh yeah.
Like we've had libraries that would like make assumptions that the address that only going to call a service IPv4, and then like unexpected behavior happening because like, well, you know, the data center moved over all the servers to IPv6 over here. So all of a sudden the call you're getting in is on IPv6 address. And it's like, oh, that runs a different code path because that will run like the public endpoint, because what we're looking for is private network in IPv4 to say like, hey, this is an internal call. Well, all of a sudden that code says that's not an internal call, even though it's in internal space for IPv6. But the problem is the lib or however they're detecting that is not the case. So yeah, tons of weird behaviors around that.
These things are insane because you never, you need to be like ultra paranoid, tinfoil hat, like living in a cave to even think about some of these things coming to fruition. Like a number of bugs we've encountered, even the VPs who were around when the chaos was happening, sort of sat back when the problem was really root caused and was like, there is no way you could have caught that. Like, who was thinking that that was a thing? Like, no one even possibly thought that one through. I'm just adding to my list of like remembering really, really stupid shit that has happened in the last like 10 years. Yeah.
I was gonna say, so yeah, there are costly mistakes that I think everyone can agree that like, okay, that is beyond expectations to be able to catch this. I think it's like what Sigma events, like where it's like 1 in a million, or like the Robinhood stuff where they're like, oh, GME, that's only like a 1 in like 4 billion chance or whatever.
Yep.
But there are things that are just clearly likely to happen, but you don't expect anyone to do it. And what I'm thinking of is, so one of the companies I used to work at, it had like a billing component to it. And if you're a paying user, like that traffic is a very tiny subset of the non-paying users. So normally you go into the website, you log in, and like 99% of traffic is non-paying. For the paying, you would call in the billing system and you'd be like, hey, is it still a valid subscription? Is it not a valid subscription? Like, should we prompt them for renewal? Right. So this team unwillingly knew or didn't know, what was it? That they overfilled their cache on Redis, and then they didn't have the list of paid users in there anymore. So what was happening was, oh, I don't have a cache, so I need to go ask. The issue that happens is like the billing system is used to like say, I don't know, 1,000 requests a second because it's a subset. The total traffic is like hundreds of thousands a second. So here's your little tiny team over here going, da, da,
Mm.
da, da. Oh my God, why are we getting 100x our traffic? Like,
Oops.
why are we essentially getting DDoSed? And the worst part was you would think, oh, you would just look at your dashboards. This was an area that was just no observability of who's making the API calls and what volume. It was all just an internal team to team trust system. And I think this is basically like the answer there is just lol. Um,
Pretty much.
and yeah, we had to, what was it? Hack together some like pulling the access logs, and then someone had written like a parser for that, because there was like a client header that we had in there, and then we put it in like some library. It wasn't like Apex charts, but similar. And someone just like graphed this out because we were pretty sure that's what it was because the volume was so big that there was only one other team in the company that could even produce that kind of volume. And they were like, "We didn't change anything. Look at our code deployments.
Oh,
Nothing
great.
has changed." It's like, what the what wasn't in the code deployments was a cron job that doesn't run a part of their normal code deployment that runs on a separate thing.
Mm.
And this caused like eviction of Redis on the cache, and they were using like least frequent used, and whatever they were putting in there was more frequent than the paid versus non-paid users. And yeah, we hacked this together, and I basically had to like print screen a chart and be like, 100% you guys, like, look, like everyone else is like down here, and you're like,
Way.
10,000% over everyone else.
No, those sorts of things are it's weird because like what you mentioned as well is it's not one thing. There was no single, hey, someone does. It's like all the holes lined up just right for this thing to kind of fall through and be like, oh, this happened and this happened and this happened all at the perfect time. So yeah. But when I think the crux of that as well is like when something like that happens, the reaction you get from the team who you're not blaming so much as you're asking and being like, what the hell are you guys doing? You need a little bit of help from them because it could get really, really one-sided if they're like, go away and come back when you fixed our problem. So
Oh,
yeah.
it was terrible. Like in that scenario, they were very adamant that it was not them.
Mm-hmm.
And there was like, I had a good relationship with one person on like that team of like 20 people. And I was just like messaging them, DMing. I'm like 99% sure. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's no other team that can produce that volume except that one other team, the team that I was talking to. It's like nobody is. I even went to the extreme. It was like even if another team was to purposely try and produce that amount of volume, they do not have the infrastructure to produce that volume. Like it was very
Mm.
clear, but from them, they're like, look at our pipeline. There has been no deployments. Nothing has changed. Oh, except this random cron thing that runs outside of the normal deployment pipeline because it's for like internal stuff. So
No, that's yeah. And the weird part as well is when something like that happens, the logical thing to do is what changed? What
yeah,
has changed? Is there any deployment? And I think all of us have experienced that moment where you're looking at the timelines going, this deployment took place, this metric spiked. This is the guy. It's when there's no deployment and out of nowhere there's the spike or dip, and you're like, why? What just happened? Yeah, so it's like that. I mean, I've had some really fun. Yeah, exactly. Like, if it was me, it's going to take a little bit of a push and a little bit of time for me to go like, yes, it was me.
yeah,
But I've had cases as well where the one example I can think of is we had a new dev on the team, not a junior developer. They were very experienced, and what they had decided to do was try and insistently run the stack of microservices on their development machine. We said to them, that is fine. Understand that some of the things you are doing is very risky because we haven't finished the remainder of the work. And the roadmap was very clear in my mind. We thought about it a lot afterwards. And the
yeah,
problem was essentially you had these hard-coded endpoints that were DNS endpoints. So it would be like calls go to like x.db.com or whatever, and like metrics go to metrics or whatever the case is. And the way we were getting around this was to manipulate your local hosts file to point to different endpoints. And that was probably not a good idea. But long story short, they ended up deciding they were going to do this. We said to them, perhaps we should first do the decoupling, ensure that you can actually point this thing to a full dev environment and not like partial, because you have to know all the endpoints it's talking to. And they were like, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. They picked the worst possible microservice to spin up, which was responsible for essentially cleaning up Tombstone data. So anything that was in one database and not the other had been, you can think of it as like the customer's intended state and what the actual backend services had done with this intended state. And if it was gone from the intended state, it meant that the customer had deleted something. So you should go in and delete all the resources. This person had wired it up in such a way that they were talking to their local database on their MacBook, but actually still communicating with the prod instance of the other database. So they started up, everything's fine, nothing goes wrong. 10 minutes in, we just start seeing delete calls, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of delete calls. Thankfully, there was a throttle, but we were at max throttle, like 300 delete calls per 5 minutes, just coming in, taking up production data, one thing after the next. And we were like, what the hell? Immediately, your instinct is someone has written horrendous logic. Has anybody pushed anything? No one's pushed anything. Then it's like, did something in the database crash? Nothing there. We found the IP of the incoming calls, found out it was this person's MacBook, essentially told them to turn it off, like stop doing anything you're doing and turn it off. And
John, just shut down the MacBook. I don't care that you're doing. Just turn it off. Literally, turn it off.
It was pretty much along those lines. Like the comment about it, the developer's first instinct is no. This poor person essentially was told, like, stop doing what you are doing, and they were like, why? In this context, shut the fucking thing down and then ask why. Like, in the time it took you to ask that question, we've nuked like a bunch of production data. And
you just went to IT, you're like, just assume the employee's terminated,
yeah,
like just cut access.
Is there a like make it blow up command? But that instance was so difficult because there, yes, we'd enabled people to do something wrong because, and I'm conflicted about this one, because this person had followed a work in progress project, which was like, how do we test this? What do we do at the moment? Yep. They sort of like looked at the wiki page, looked at the code, was like, I'm totally comfortable with this. I'll be fine. And then half-baked these instructions together, not being fully aware of what the dangers were. Should we have written the wiki in such a way to be like, don't continue? Maybe that could have been an approach. Or do the following tests to see what's going on. But it's so screwy because from that mistake, we also learned like the stats endpoint and the metrics endpoint and the logging endpoints were all being poisoned by test data because crap was getting pushed to those potentially if people were doing half these instructions correctly, half incorrectly. Yep. So it's a lot of like, oh, hold on, there's even more nuanced things here. And it's incredibly costly because what you've done is taken the entire team off of what they're doing and put them into a fight or flight mode. You've caused production outages. You've caused customer pain. There's a whole bunch of things that have gone wrong here. And how do you prevent it? Like, that's, I mean, if we knew, that would have been amazing. But even there, the problem was well understood. It was just someone doing the wrong thing. And yes, it was.
Yeah. And I think we've discussed this scenario before. And it's like, there's plenty of scenarios to get like, to avoid this. It's like, how does a dev on a laptop even able to connect to the production endpoints, right? Like
that's it. That's exactly it. Like,
even if you have all the wiki page, it's like, yeah, but how did they connect over to prod?
Yeah. So my mindset is changing very rapidly in exactly the direction you're saying, which is like process is fine. There's amazing process on all sorts of things. None of it is as effective as just proper tooling. Like don't tell a person, hey, make sure you run these 5 test commands and do this 3 a.m. when there's a like high severity issue. They're not going to look at that. If you turned it off completely and made it 100% safe and said to someone, there is no way you could possibly connect to a production database, go ahead. That's probably a better thing. So real safeguards would be a good idea. But yeah.
When we were discussing prior, it triggered another memory of mine
Mm-hmm.
We were discussing about like looking for change,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if we have ever discussed this before, but
Mm.
there was a weekend where um, Google contacted us and basically was like, "We're suspending your Google BigQuery account due to insufficient funds,"
Oops.
and we were just like, it's probably like a billing issue, and there was some lack of communication to understand how severe this was, and misunderstanding over email. So it was like a Saturday, and then on Monday, people realized like, oh, this is actually kind of a big deal. It's for like analytical stuff internal to the company, and there's other downstream, or in this, I guess upstream, people depend on this data to do other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like figuring out bidding prices, and if you're doing like advertising, you need to know like in relatively some sort of ideally real time, but you're looking at historical data eventually, and then you're figuring out new bidding prices. If that doesn't work, you're just going by whatever was the prior amount.
Okay, that makes sense.
um, and this was like, okay, that's its own issue, like that is a indirect consequence of this. And so you're like, okay, what happened? Someone forgot to update the credit card, or what's going on here? No, we in the weekend spent a month worth our normal budget. And this was not like some small startup. Like people say that it's like, oh, we had normally we only spent 500, but this
Yeah.
month was 2,000. It's like our bill was like $200,000 in one weekend.
Holy shit.
Um, so, and the worst part was when they contacted Google, they're like, we need this shit back up, but
Yeah.
we'll pay. And you're sitting at your computer, and like every like I think it was like what every 5 minutes you get a new billing event on Google BigQuery. So you hit like refresh, and you're like, holy shit, it just went up like whatever amount, like $1,500, whatever it was. And you're just
Whoa.
sitting there refreshing, you're just seeing the cost
No.
continue. Visibility was an issue. Everyone had like a shared account, or mostly shared accounts, or even if they had different accounts,
Mm-hmm.
who was making calls and where they were going was very limited visibility. Um, and It was even more complex because they had the system that was called Vortex. It's not related to anything. It's just a product name, and essentially you could call in, and then that would call out to many different APIs or databases, depending on what data you want and what you're touching. So sometimes it goes to Cassandra, other times it Google BigQuery, other times it'd be Elasticsearch cluster, right? You're just making this generic gateway to end data sources.
Mm-hmm.
And so we knew it was like, okay, so that is the issue. We've locate that. Now, who is calling that, and why is someone calling so much? Um, Once again, fucking cron jobs, twice at the same company that got us.
There we go.
Is no one could find anything, and no one, like, there wasn't enough visibility. And this Vortex system, everyone in the company used. Like 400 engineers could all call into it, any product, any team. So you're just like, I remember the email just going out to all management in engineering, basically be like, everyone list out literally on this day between this time and this time, every single deployment, anything you changed, anything.
Wow.
And just every team just listing out
Oh god.
basically everything that happened. And finally one team was like, well, we don't think it's related, but we changed this random cron job thing. And it's like, okay, what does it do? And you realize, okay, this calls Vortex. And you're calling like every second. And they're like, yeah, but that team approved it. That team told us, like, we asked them if there was any limits. Because when they had talked to this team, it was like, should be worried. And it's like, nah, you're never going to overwhelm us. So like the team could take much more than, one request a second. Like the problem was no one had actually asked, what range of data are you going to get in these 1 second requests? What they had said was, we just want to look at historical ad stuff, because they were using it to determine if there was like a section of the site down that was missed on monitoring.
Okay.
Because if your ads aren't displayed, then
you're not making money.
You're losing money, and you know that there's an issue somewhere that hasn't been on a page, or no one's noticed elsewhere. So they were essentially doing a bunch of like historical data analysis and forecasting on all ad data since the
Whoa.
beginning of time. So they go to Google BigQuery and they're like, yeah, can you please scan over like 20
Everything.
petabytes of data every second? Every
That
second they
is.
would show up for this. Um,
Oh
yeah,
God.
so that was how we managed to spend like $200,000 in the span of like 3 days on Google BigQuery.
That is
And
amazing.
yeah.
That is. Wow. But I mean, there again, like, what? It's fun to think about, like, what could have prevented this? Like, anything?
It was like a combination of things, like better visibility, like, you know, through that, a lot of the conversation was actually not about the visibility and more about surfacing up budgeting and cost to the teams themselves. So, like, in an ideal world, yeah, everyone can see everything and you get that. From this, it was more like, okay, yeah, let's do that, but let's also make it so that teams just get capped out budget calls when we call upstream to something else.
Mm-hmm.
This way, if a team wants to call us every second, and they want to call for the last hour of ad data, that's not an issue. But your total spend is going to be 10K a month or whatever is allocated. If you exceed that, all access just stops for your team, regardless.
So
Um,
I'm wondering if what you're explaining is essentially any kind of outgoing calls need to have, even if it's a very thin layer, something that allows for throttling, allow list, block list, permissions, models, auditing, all of those things, just to have a place to live. It needn't do anything at the beginning.
yep.
It could just forward the request and let it happen later on, because that seems to be in line with what we said about process not being enough and actual tooling. So if there's these, everything has a it's not even a hook, because you want it to be able to stop it. You want some gating mechanism to be like, if you're calling our database, we will stop this from happening. Because I've worked at a company where they were like, hey, here's read-only database access, go to the website. First thing people do, select star from star, enter, boom, and DB performance crashes. Someone gets a ticket, they phone the person, what are you doing? We're canceling your query. Don't let it happen. Like, put a time limit, put a size limit, put an auto limit or something. But that's the thing. With that said, it also introduces problems. I've got a really funny one for you as well. That's the opposite of the billing situation you had. Cloud
You
computing.
were making too much money?
No, it was completely. We were responsible for doing the billing, and what happens is this cloud computing has this really weird, like, yes, they're imaginary computers. The physical machine that takes, like, the physical core that is responsible for running certain VMs. There's
Mm-hmm.
weird legal requirements that come in with proprietary operating systems. So, like, if you have a Windows VM and a Linux VM, if they're on the same core, you pay the Windows license and it's like dirtied for a certain amount of time. And if you reuse a dirty core, you're not using another machine. So you're kind of sharing the same license. And there's this weird placement logic that has to take place. Yeah, because of that, there's this really, really archaic process for billing people and validating that the bills are
Yep.
correct. So what happens is essentially there's a start and end event that gets logged somewhere, and all you're doing is tying the imaginary computer to the physical one, and you're like, hey, VM A started at this time and used 4 cores, VM B used 5 cores, one of them wasn't dirty, one of them was dirty, let's do this whole thing. So we had this crazy script that, it terrifies me to say this, was literally emailed between people because the information was kind of never really handed over. Yeah, dirty cores. Was never handled correctly. And it came with this like set of instructions in the email, and you would get this Python script and you would run it, and it would go out, get all of the events, and then give you a listing that was essentially, at this time, this machine was doing this, and at this time, this
Yep.
machine was doing this, to tally the totals, group them by user ID, and send out their bills. This is the validation that the metering is correct. There we go. So everything's fine on this Friday afternoon at like 4 p.m.
Of course, right?
Yeah, completely. The architect and the VP walk into my cubicle, and there is absolutely no reason, unless I'm getting surprise promoted to CTO, that those two people should be there. Like there's no good reason they're there, and you could almost hear the conversations from the cubes quieting.
So the whispers along as they
The-
see all the heads turning and
exactly,
everything. Like,
and it's like who's gonna be the recipient of this? They walk into my cube and go, "We're running the billing data, and we're getting inconsistent results." So I'm like, "Well, no shit. It's if you run it every hour, you're getting the per hour results. Like that's what's happening." They're like, "No, no, no. We're putting in a timestamp and trying to get the cost per customer at a certain hour, and every time we do it, we get different results for like 20% of our records." So it's like, what the hell is going on? It's the most simple script we have. It's like a dirty hack to pull some logs, put it in a database, get the things in group by. Nothing complicated. So I'm like, no, this can't be. So we start taking this thing apart, and like the day gets later and later, and we're eventually down to like, this is the core thing that is doing the query. We run it and we count the rows, and then we run it again and we get the same number of rows, but the result is different. And we're like, what the fuck is going on? We keep digging and keep digging and keep digging. And out of just pure coincidence, we're hacking away at this thing, and the one person notices that there's a next page token on the data type that's being returned that's never been there before. It was never a paginated API. It was just get me all the results, and that's fine. Somewhere along the line, a person decided that a good job for an intern would be to implement.
I was just about to say,
Yeah.
this is probably an intern.
Yeah, they implemented pagination on the database API that we were calling. They didn't think to have it be a optional parameter, because in their mind, pagination is good, so everyone must do it. No one should query everything. But they didn't fucking tell anyone. So we were doing this, and the random row count was the result of a whole bunch of aggregation things. Because if you did just normal queries, you were stuck with like 800 rows. That was all you could get every single time. But because of the data wrangling we were doing, the number was weird. And this thing meant that we got the stale data that was, or not stale data, we were getting partial data and trying to do things from it. But it was the most, like, it was completely chilled until we found out this happened. And then the between the three of us, the most like political response came from the VP, which was, that probably makes sense, but we should have documented it. The architect's response was like, who the, like, just went off and was like, who does this? Doesn't put in deprecation policy, doesn't put in a warning. We have like, and just starts like ranting about things.
And then whoever asked the co-op was like, well, it was a co-op, and that co-op's probably gone now.
Well, that's it. That's the situation. It's like, who even did, where does this code reside, and why were they doing this? What do we do? Like, how do we find someone to fire? Like, that was the sentiments that were kind of happening. And like in that case, now what they've done is they've implemented a process to stop people from doing bad things, but they didn't tell anyone. So stop putting guardrails on is not always the solution, but holy shit, was that a frustrating day. Like, it finished off at like 8 p.m. with just sheer exhaustion, because you can't, there's a kind of focus you put in when you're trying to do something and you're in the zone. But when you have people, like someone who's got 20 years more experience than you on their laptop next to you, and you're sitting with your laptop on your lap, and you've got this VP literally pacing like 2 meters one way, 2 meters the other way for like 4 hours, trying to be cool.
And then on top, it's like things like, oh, the billing report for like the whole month is going out in like 5 hours.
Well,
and
that was the catch. It needed to be done by the Monday, and they only figured it out on the Friday, coincidentally, because one of the runs and the way the data was being populated was, it wasn't really in a sensible order. I'm not sure whether the tables were being rewritten or what the hell was happening, but every time you did it, you got these non-deterministic results. So there, it's like massively costly, because we literally didn't bill people correctly. And it could have like, we did a couple of runs just for fun afterwards, and we found that the variance because of there being, we were essentially losing entire clients, not just ours. So if you lost like Joe's Corner Shop, whose VM is running like payroll once a month at like $5,000, that's fine. But if you lost like the equivalent of Netflix, it's 80%
That
of the
customer
pay.
was loving you.
It would have been amazing. Like we joked, like what would have happened if the billing went out and they went something along the lines of, you owe us $10 for the rental of like IPs. Like no VM was used, no database was used. That's it.
So
Hayes would have rolled.
this reminds me of two things. One, SQL bug. So very similar circumstances. You, different results. Ended up we found just a MySQL bug. Literally just based off of the query that we're doing and how we're doing it and just the ordering, we discovered a bug.
Wow.
Like just changing. I think we literally added something like a fake filter, something that we didn't even need to filter on, and everything worked. Like the exact same thing, and then we would filter on like where this column is equal to basically all the values, like
Wow.
anything, like is not null, but we have no data that's null.
Yeah.
So, or vice versa. It's like so you knew it was correct, and it was the same thing. It's like it would just miss some rows sometimes, and like back and forth, and we thought maybe it was replication delay. We ruled that out. Eventually, we just said, "Fuck it." Okay, we point directly to that team's master. Still, how do you get data missing on the master? Like,
then
it's not
there's a problem.
possible. Yeah. Like, there's no network delay. There's no nothing. There's no time sync. It's like atomic operation happened. We even had it where they ran the same as us. And the weird thing was sometimes they would get the rows that we were missing, and we would get the rows that were missing. And it's like, WTF.
Did you guys get into a panic state where you're like, okay, let's run it 25 times and just aggregate everything? Because those are the conversations when things start getting hairy. You're like, it's not deterministic.
We had, we had a very sketchy hack until we could get down to whatever the issue was, which was just like, fuck it, just run it like 1,000 times.
That's it. That's exactly it. Like the dumbest shit comes out to play when these mistakes happen. It's like, we know there's a mistake. Let's just ice this cake.
And the worst part about this is, in our circumstance, this had been running for a while.
Oh God.
So we had to go back and write like a pipeline job to go back and pull all the data and fix it until finally it got down to a point where we had ruled out everything. And then it was like, I think we might have found a SQL bug. Like in this case with MySQL. It's like, I think we actually have found, and it wasn't like we're lagging, like, 20 versions behind or something. Like, I think we're just one version behind the stable.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, okay. And I think it was literally someone noticed something odd because I think we removed one of the fields that we were filtering on, but we could never get the partial data set in that. We would always get the full amount with the extra that we didn't need. So I think at that point, what we did was we removed the filter on the where. We took all the data on application side. We just dropped the stuff we didn't need until we could, like, WTF. Whenever we add this one thing here in the SQL that we send to MySQL, all of a sudden we get this weird partial results. Long story short, we had found a bug. That got solved by, I think we said something like where data is not null, and we never had null data. So we always got, like, we avoided whatever this internal bug was. The other thing, which was related to the cost stuff, is I a long time ago worked for a casino software company. And there was some Reddit post on someone asked, how do you generate like true like random number generation?
Oh yeah, there we go.
And me being much younger was like, haha, I'm gonna write essentially what is the code that runs this at the casino, as an example, relatively the same. And it was like, okay, you get off a dev view random, and we were doing a bunch of random byte stuff off that. And I write this. I'm all proud of myself. Like, yeah, get my karma. And then the next day, someone replies and tells me, no, that's actually not correct. You have an issue on, like, I think it was like numbers that would be zero, or when you're asking for numbers that would contain zero or something, and the way that you're doing the byte packing, there's going to be an issue. And so we actually had a skew on the distribution.
Oh no.
And you're a casino company.
Oh, shit.
So you know when they say the house always wins? House only wins if the stats are correct.
Oh.
So we did some analysis. I think it was something like we had lost like $400,000 because of this. And it was like we had paid out $200,000 extra, but the other part of this was that the not only did we pay out 200,000, but we should have actually had not paid out the 200,000 at all. So it would have netted us like 400K of earnings for the house.
Damn.
And this had been there for a very long time. Like, and this was just, and honestly, once I went and talked to like the tech lead at the time, I was like, listen, I didn't copy the code from the company. I wrote very similar to our RNG. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to get in so much shit. Like, someone's going to be like, why did I even say this? And he read the comment, and he's like, oh, wow, yeah, they're right. And right away, he's like, okay, we need to fix this.
Whoa. That is, damn.
And this is why having open source code is really good for your company, because it's open source.
That's exactly it. Like that is exactly it. So, okay, a weirdly similar story with the open source situation saving us and random. We had a situation where essentially distributed systems work by giving a random ID to a host that starts up. You start up, you get this ID, this is yours. If you want to do a distributed lock, if you want to do something like that, it grabs it. Turns out Python's random number generator is based off of the first MAC address in your Linux listing. So that is part of, like, partial seed takes place for that.
Ah, okay.
Cool. So we didn't know this. And it's funny, it's really funny, because these are things that are like burnt into my brain that I now remember because of the weird underlying subsystems work, because of them being so painful. So we had this problem where we have this distributed system, multiple hosts start up, and they shard a set of data, and they're responsible for maintaining the state of some resource for like a certain subset. So like machine A says, I'm covering 1 through 10. Machine B says, like, I'm covering 11 through 20, whatever. What ended up happening was we had this behavior where something would start up, and like 5 machines would jump onto it and be like, I'm going to take this. And then they would all get the lock, and they would all try manipulating it, and weirder shit was happening. Like retries were happening unexpectedly. Some were being ultra performant, and it just made no sense. So we're like, what the hell's going on? So then we list the number of machines that are live. We get 1 entry because it's got 1 ID. And we're like, this makes no sense. We log in using the UUID as like a convenience endpoint. We get on a machine and debugging with someone, and they're like, oh, look at this log file. This is what's happening. And I'm like, I'm on the same box. Why does my log file look different to yours? So I'm like, okay, hold on, let me double check. Log out, log back in, get the same file. Cool. 20 minutes later, log out, log back in, different file. I'm like, what the hell's going on? It turns out, after a lot of debugging and a lot of swearing and everything, Python's random number generator was responsible for generating the UUID for the host without taking any timestamp as a seed. It was using the MAC address as the seed. When it starts, it's like the very first operation it does. It says, I'm now this is my random ID. I will base everything off of this. Someone had decided that they were going to do routine maintenance on the machines in the data center, and they plugged in USB Ethernet devices that took the first slot, and the MAC address of this device exists when it's plugged in. When you pull it out, the driver's there and says, I don't know what the fuck you want. So its MAC address is 00000 the whole time.
Yep.
So we had 25 machines that had undergone maintenance, and all of them had the same random number generator. So when you rebooted them and they came back, if you were in Python and asked for a random number, it would give you the same random number, which is like, you can't even, when this happened, it was like a super senior engineer came in and said, are you guys sure that the random number generator is working? We're like, that is the most ridiculous statement I've ever heard. We are a cloud computing company. Like, what do you mean Python's random number is not random? Like, are you crazy? We opened the code and we're like, where is this coming from? Like, why are there system level calls? Why is it calling the network stack? Do an ifconfig on these machines, and the very first address is zeros. And you're like, oh my God, I have learned so much today because someone decided to do unplanned maintenance or not notify us and just thinking everything is fine. And it caused the most crazy behavior. Like, it was a total write-off. That day, all resources were free. Like, because you got them, it was potentially going to be hyper efficient or like completely slow or not, or some non-deterministic behavior between it. So yeah, in cases like that, I guess it's blind faith that the random number generator is good. Like, yes, it's truly random.
Yeah, RNG is just one of those things where you just bank on the existing of what everyone else has done, and you just pray it works the way that you think it works.
Well, that's the thing. Like, yeah, it's exactly that. And during the shit show, people were like, hey, do we write our own? I'm like, oh my God, who said that? Get out. Like, no. Like, no one wants to do that. But yeah, I don't know. Because there's, I think we've repeated it a bunch of times. Like, what do you do to prevent that? How do you test?
You tell the data center, listen, no USB keys.
There we go. Yeah. Someone go in, solder the cages shut. Like,
you have to, everything's got to be through packages, and you install just through the package, no USB sticks. Like, actually, there's like kind of a truth to that. Like, I'm surprised there's even any operation done over the USB aside from installing like the OS. And even then, usually it's like, oh, they have like the virtual ways of installing that now over a KVM. And
so, I mean, it's made me cynical and grumpy, and I appreciate the words of so many senior people who've said it, and I've been like, that's ridiculous. Don't make change. That's it. If it's something can be immutable, let it be immutable. Like, if I could have a in-memory only kind of data store that's running on an immutable storage platform, that would be incredible. I don't even want a hard drive. I want the thing to be like a chip that you cannot change. Like, there we go.
You're just going to be a embedded system, Andre. You deploy your code, and it's just embedded right on the computer. You can't even update it.
Nope, that's it.
It's
I want
to be flawless from the get-go.
Yeah, I want to be like in that time frame of like sci-fi movies where you can look. It's like a modular synthesizer where like this thing just does one thing. All it does is when you push a button, the time comes out. That's it. It's a piece of hardware. This thing makes random numbers. This is a gate, and it does this, and that's it. Like, you build these. It sounds like it's one step above a steam engine, but like, immutability is perfect. Let's make a small unit of work, make it work, and then don't change it.
If you need true randomness, they sell hardware that uses like radioisotopes, I guess, basically on it and whatnot.
Yeah.
But it reminded me when you said like don't make change of one of the issues that I had written down for this actually is when our favorite thing, Andre, legacy code.
Oh yeah.
When you're trying to, you think legacy is the worst thing ever, and you're like, God damn it, there's so much duplication. I'm going to refactor to go from like this, copy and pasta way of things over to this general whatnot way. And so long story short is someone decided this at one of the companies I worked. And the other problem was this was legacy code with not a ton of test coverage. So Probably not the best thing to be refactoring. It's just not test covering what you're refactoring. And I don't remember the whole thing, but they had basically taken a bunch of like copy and paste and put it into a method, and then called that method. And I don't remember what was the case, but when they had done this, what had happened was we basically introduced a bug, and this bug, there was two issues this person did. They're very similar time frames, so I'm trying to remember which way it was. One bug, it might have been this way or not. No, that bug was just the wrong characters, backwards characters, on an implementation. Okay. So first, let's talk about refactoring. That broke something and basically just cost us millions of dollars. It's the short answer of that.
Ouch.
And the other bug was, what was it? The other bug was related to, so they had switched two bits backwards. Like instead of 1 0, they sent 0 and 1. And the problem with testing in this scenario is if your tests are like, if you write the test incorrectly, your code is going to pass those tests and you think your code is correct.
Mm-hmm.
So these tests were written incorrectly. And then you think, okay, well, end-to-end test. Well, the problem that comes with end-to-end test is normally this is an issue when you own the entire end-to-end.
Mm-hmm.
But in this scenario and this team, it's a bank. This bank doesn't have a dev environment you can just end-to-end.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't do an end-to-end test and call this bank.
No,
without doing like a legitimate purchase. And then the question is, well, why don't you do that? Because how do I get an API called credit card to do these things and actually get the money back on the card in an automated way? Like
the risk there is, I mean, if there was a test endpoint at a bank and you could print a transaction on a test endpoint, I would not go near that company for all the money in the world. But yes.
So, like some of the banks have test labs, test environments, but not all of them do.
Mm-mm.
And so in this case, what happened was, what did we flip? Well, when you go to refund someone, instead of refunding them, it charged their card again. So me and you had talked about this, I think, before. So if someone calls in and asks us for a refund because they didn't make the charge, or they don't want it, or they're disputing it, and you tell them no problem, and 3 to 5 whatever business days you'll see it. 3 to 5 business days. What are you guys doing? I have now 2 charges from you. They're already pissed about the first charge. Now they have 2 charges. Sir, don't worry. I'll just refund both of them. But now they have, in 3 to 5 days, they're going to actually have 4 charges on their credit card. This reminds me of the other issue too. So in those scenarios, it's like, okay, obviously the lessons is like, don't refactor code that doesn't have test coverage. Start with the test coverage.
No, you can't. You cannot, like that right there. If you like, we praise legacy code. It needs a test, please. That's my PSA.
And there is I hate saying it, but there's some truth to like, don't break it if don't break it if it's fixed.
Don't break it if it's broken.
Don't fix it if it's not broken.
Yes.
Like there's a place and time to do that when the business is evolving, but like this code had been the same way for like 10 years, I think. Now, the other issue with this was importing data. That stuff scares me to this day still. Like company A acquires company B, and they're like, okay, we want all this billing information now in this system. And this is not a feature, right? We don't have a generic import feature. It's now a company has been acquired and they want to shut down all that company. So you need to take over, in this case, like the billing operations of it. So you're like, okay, we're going to write a bunch of these hacky things that just, allow us to put it into the database, because there's no such thing as an import feature. We don't have an import feature. And even if we write an import feature, eventually you're going to make the database calls anyways. And I think I mentioned this to you before too, but for those who are watching, data import successfully. The data that the company that we had acquired had a different concept of what subscription end meant and what the subscription status meant. And essentially what happens was we import all these subscriptions with end dates that are way in the advance. And what we thought meant the subscription was active. And what they actually meant was the subscription is not active. And our payment system had an operation where it's like, if you're in the future, or sorry, if I haven't billed you prior times, I need to pass bill you for your missed payments. So there was customers who we tried to bill for 3 years.
They must have
when
been
we imported them.
so happy with you. So happy with you.
Remember getting a support ticket where the person literally emailed in being, I can't make rent. And you can see their bill starting at like $2,000, their balance at $2,000. And we just hit them for like $50, like for 3 years worth. And the worst was we actually overdraft them. So then I can see us every time we charge again, costs us like a $25 overdraft fee each single time.
Holy shit.
So that
wow.
That you leverage your vendors and your partnerships, because that took a lot of like cross communication with a bunch of different people to be like, we had a bug, please revert all your charges, we are going to revert all of our charges, there's nothing that the customer has done that's wrong, and then have a ton of like customer support issues, because there was times where like, you know, a bank will say, yeah, we will we'll remove the charges related to you.
Yeah.
But we're not going to remove the charges of like, if there was a rent payment that bounced and that checked in clear,
yeah,
like that's on you guys. Like,
holy shit. That's like a witness protection case where you're like, can I go outside? Does anyone know who I am? Because that's a problem.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think we also talked about this one, which was having code that isn't it calls API endpoints that aren't even documented anymore.
Oh yeah.
Like it's so old. And then we find out like there's a bug at the bank on the way that we're using this old undocumented API call that they don't even have in their documentation anymore. Like, you know, the documentation goes back 10 years and this was implemented 13 years ago. And literally no one knows that these flags even exist, I guess. And having a nice conversation with the bank, telling them like, hey, you're paying us when you actually shouldn't be paying us. Like,
oops.
There's, in this case, let's say it's $100 remaining on a card, and we ask for 150, and they tell us, no, you can only have 100. And, okay, thanks for the $100. Partial charge is what this is called. And then at settlement, which is like basically when the bank tallies up everything and says what they're paying you and what, because of what they've able to get from the cards, all of a sudden the bank shows up and is like, yeah, we owe you $150. It's like, whoa, wait, what?
What? Just
you only actually were able to get 100. You even told me you could only get 100 off the card. And we even tested this internally at the team. We got like a prepaid card, and it was like, there's only $100 on the card charge. And then at settlement, we asked to charge for 150. No, you can only get 100. And at settlement, the bank's like, oh, we owe you 150. It's like, where did that $50 just come from?
Cryptocurrency. Now I fully understand what it means. No, that is those. I think the thing you just mentioned about, again, with the like legacy code is if you find weird endpoints, or like I've had a case where calling V2 and you look at the docs and they're on like V7 and they're like V6 was deprecated 2 years ago. You're like, oh shit, where am I going with this? Like the format is completely different. Everything is wrong. Okay, how do I phrase this to not throw someone under the bus? So at a previous company, a person was tasked with owning something that became the legacy endpoint. And they used to have a flag, which was like, skip all safety mechanisms, just put force and it'll do it. 5 years later, that person hadn't touched the code. They'd progressed up the food chain in the company. And they were like, just add force to the flag and it'll enforce this operation. Done. Complete bullshit. Yes, exactly. That's the flag. It was a complete placebo. It had been removed like 3 years prior, but it wasn't removed from the API or the API spec. So when you ran it, when you generated the CLI to talk to that API, it had the force flag, and people were like, use the force, and then we joke about some kind of Star Wars reference, and it would work because of something just taking time. The first time they ran it, it was busy processing, and then it was like, we try again with force. Hey, it worked so quickly. And no one had a damn clue that this thing was totally unreliable and not there. So much so that we got tickets cut from other parts of the company. They were like, hey, do you mind changing this internal operation to use the force flag? We're like, yeah, cool, whatever. Like, we've tried telling you for 2 years now, no one's listening. Here's your placebo. Go ahead. Burn this incense while you run the delete. It'll go quickly. Like, it's amazing. Oh, nice.
I had a really fun, it wasn't costly, but a funny situation recently. I don't do a lot of, well, actually, a lot. I don't do almost anything related to like JavaScript world, Node, any of this TypeScript shenanigans. And a lot more stuff I do is on like infrastructure side, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the scenario that happened was essentially in Kubernetes, you can set things for like auto scaling and like when to scale up more of these containers. They're called pods in Kubernetes, but and you set it like a memory or CPU threshold. If you're using more than the average aggregate of like 70% of, you have four containers. Okay, great. Add plus 1, 5. Now the problem is, when you're under stress and you need to, like, your systems are overwhelmed, you're like, okay, you have a couple options: add more or make it larger, or both. And like, okay, refactor the code, all that, but like time critical options. Like, I don't have time to go in and debug. Like, the site is going down now. We need to resolve this very second.
Fix right now, yeah.
Scale up or scale out, right? And then in this case, they had decided scale, I think, out and up. Like just more
and bigger
and larger.
There we go.
Here's the problem. The default was, okay, you got to use 1 core. So they're like, YOLO, 4 cores, more CPU. And things just got worse after they did this. And, and it wasn't like constant worse because user traffic. So they have some sort of like curves. But every time they would have their highest peaks, it would just be
the worst.
Worse than any time before.
Okay.
And someone at some point had mentioned something about like how Node works and the Node event cycle, loop cycle, whatever it's called. And it chimed on me. I had a flash in my head, literally, of the configuration of the autoscaler that they had set. And I'm like, hold on, wait. So you're only going to be able to basically use 1 core in Node.js.
Oh.
At least on the version, there it was like 12 or 14. And like, okay, even on the latest, you can use a little bit more and all that. But essentially 1 core. Wait, you just said the box gets access to 4 cores. And your auto scaling only works if the aggregate average is over 80%. But the max anyone can actually use is 25%. They can only max out 1 core. So you essentially got a scenario where once they changed that, they actually disabled indirectly their auto scaling altogether.
Oh God, because you're changing the metric and it's averaging across the cores that aren't available to them.
Yeah. Oh. So before it was working, but they just needed more. They needed to set more mint and higher max. But once they had changed the vertical of each container, the thresholds were never met for the auto scaling because of how Node works. That essentially they turned off the auto scaling.
Oh my God. That's
This was the summary that
yep.
I felt when I saw this.
Yeah.
And the luck was crazy. It was someone just said this to me, and I literally just had like the configuration just pop up in my head, and I was like,
Wow.
wait, what? I'm like, wait, if it can only use basically one core, and
Mm-hmm.
the configuration is set to give each pod four. I'm like, the max you're going to use is like 30%. Let's see, and auto scaling only works if the aggregate of all is over 80 or 75%, whatever it is. It won't
Yeah.
even need it for one ever.
God,
None of them will ever be above that.
that is
So yeah.
wow. That is amazing. Like things like that are awesome because you like I joke on stream all the time. Yeah, it's almost like was written in Python. The more you proverbially bleed from these problems, the more you will always remember it, and anything remotely connected to it becomes this thing you're hypersensitive to. It's like I experienced people screaming at me screaming with people and at people, and just all of that makes some of these things hard to, they're a part of your DNA now. Like
Yep.
nothing I studied out of a textbook will be as like ingested as something I was asked during an interview. And nothing that I feared for like losing customer data on scale or nuking production hardware or any of those things. The that thing that happens is like being smacked by the info. And you're saying like it's this aha moment. I've had twice I've been burnt with string concatenation where people were like, oh, it's just an infinitely length string. It'll be fine. And both times similar assumptions were made, terrible mistakes were made. And now I will be that guy where a junior will be like, hey, I'm doing this with a string. I'm like, whoa, everyone stop. I want to look at every single code path that this thing is following. I don't care if it's a name field that's just going from like one method to another. How big can it be? How small can it be? Can it take special characters? What are you doing to mutate it? What happens if it's longer than we expect? What happens if it's shorter than we expect? And the times it's happened, people have looked at me like, you are going to be hell to work with. Like, you are going to be a shitty person to work with. But it's just that one sensitive area that I've been bitten on. And it's, yeah.
And the worst is when you've had your logs and you see something like undefined show up in
Oh,
there, and you're
yeah.
like, but then you find out someone signed up with the username undefined.
So,
Yep.
things like that where people put test data in, and it's like exactly like you're saying, autocomplete, enter first name, test first name, enter second name, test first name. And then you look at the logs and you're like, what the fuck is going on? Why am I getting first names in second name places?
Yeah.
Yeah, undefined is a great username. Thank you.
The other thing that comes to mind is not being able to reproduce things because this, what was it? It was like acrylic characters, but whatever we were using to look at the data, let's say it was like MySQL, and we are using, we'll just say DB Beaver, I don't think it was this, didn't support the acrylic character, so we'd go back to like Latin 1 for us.
Oh, no.
But in the database, it was acrylic character. So we would copy this value, put it in our script, and not get the same issue. Because we're copying from something that's gone back to Latin 1, displaying in Latin 1. So we copy the non-acrylic, like let's say it doesn't have A with a dot over it or a little tick or whatever. And so we're all like, look, like this bug is not reproducible, not reproducible, not reproducible, until you finally go, okay, let's just spin something up in that box and run it directly. And all of a sudden you're like, wait, how's it reproducible there? Well, because that actually goes and asks the database. And those libraries that you're using in that code actually get the acrylic character. You're not copying a value anymore, right? How many times I've had like people show up and be like, there's a bug, I can't connect to blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, no, it works for me, works for me, works for me. WTF, how are you doing this? And it's like, fuck, they're copying the goddamn white space at the end or the fucking new line character. God damn it.
The number, like having a name that has an accent on the E, the number of times I have had emails and actual printed paperwork where it's like just a square, the unrenderable character square. Like, please pick a font that's got at least the characters we need.
I couldn't use airport kiosks for flying for
Mm.
like the first 2 years when they came out because I have a hyphenated last name.
Oh shit.
And I guess some old school airline system didn't said last names can only be, you know, alphanumeric and
Oh,
hyphens don't count. And yeah, for first 2 years of those kiosks coming out, I couldn't actually use them because I have a hyphen in my last name. And yeah, so
that's amazing. That is no, I think those are the kinds of things. But overall, I don't think there's a end all fix all for this problem. But well, these problems. But I think this is maybe what people are looking for when they say experience needed. If you're working in a place and you've seen some of these things or heard the war stories or just I've spoken to people before who've told me about similar stories and you're just like, wow, I can't imagine having been in your position for like 24 hours while this was happening. Like,
I had
mm,
someone I worked with accidentally run like a rm-fr
mm,
instead of on /star, it was on just star.
mm.
Or sorry, no, it was on. They didn't put the /star. Um, that was a terrible story because that person actually lied and tried to cover it up, and then
Oh
eventually they
no.
got caught,
Oh
and
yeah.
they had to be fired. Uh,
How
and
I'm
the worst
assuming
thing,
flying. They were
yeah,
fired for
well,
not
because
coming out.
malicious activity,
Yeah.
like not coming forward on it, and it wasn't like, oh, it happened and like they didn't come forward in 5 minutes. It was like
Yeah.
2 days later. And the worst part was it was on a staging server. That didn't even matter. They restored from Snapshot. So
Mm,
like this person just was like, I was never on it. Thankfully, they deleted something at some point that caused, I guess, kernel panic and stopped the delete. So what happened was the ops team took the hard drive, remounted it, and was able to get like the bash history or
yeah.
something,
Yeah.
and could just see like the user logged in at the time that ran the command, and like yeah.
You
So
can't. I think like one thing that people don't truly believe is if you keep quiet about making a mistake like that, you will be fired. If you
oh yeah,
come out, the enthusiasm to which you come out with this bad news is almost inversely proportional to the action that's taken. Like if you run out of a cube and you're like, "Oh my god, I just turned everything off," people are going to be like, "We're going to help you. We're going to totally be on your side. Get this done." If you sit there and just like, yes, you're going to freak out if something like that happens, but you have to just go with it, treat it as if someone else did it, because I think that whole flag situation is a common one. Um, I worked somewhere where we ran a remote admin tool that's like do something remote on these set of hosts, and the operation was grep the logs for shutdown. But they didn't realize that what they had actually done was instead of passing the shutdown argument to the grep, it was a second command. So they were like grep for all these things and then shut down.
shut everything.
So yeah, um,
Why are all these boxes I just ran the command on turning off?
oh, and that feeling when you run a command that should take a second to execute and it takes like 5 and you're like, what, why, what's,
I think a
oh,
lot of people have been there with like databases
oh my
where
god.
you forgot like it's to limit this like the where clause or something,
Mm-hmm.
or you thought you ran it on dev instance, but you ran it on prod or something. You're like, all right, this should take like 1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe there's delay.
Yeah.
No. Oh my god, I forgot the where clause. It's
Well,
updating everything to actually this
that's
happened before. Someone I know, they updated literally all the passwords in like all the users for the company to
mm,
like a QA test 1 2 3.
oh god.
Um, and restoring there isn't really, even if you get the backup, it's like okay, yeah, but there's new users and like how do we restore all that and restore like the backups are usually like database A is totally we just restore, we move on. In
Mm-hmm.
this case, it was like you run that command, everything else has changed. You can't just restore. Like there's things
Well,
happening
well,
still, right? Like
that's that's for sure a thing people don't realize as well. Not everything can be rolled out in a piecemeal fashion. Not everything
Yeah.
can be undone, um, like a major social network outage, and not everything can be partially like tested. People don't realize you can't like a prime example is microservices. You can deploy a one box of a version of something that's using an
Yeah.
internal API. Nothing calls it. People are like, hey, process says in order to meet this compliance, we have to roll this out for 24 hours. There it sits, it does absolutely nothing. And then people jump on it later on going, how could you have tested this for 2 days and you didn't discover the problem? Your tests are useless. They're purely like ego stroking mechanisms to be comfortable with what the tech box says. But yeah, anyway, I think there's so many, and every time I hear these war stories, the common factor is that either there was someone doing something they shouldn't have done, which is one problem area, or there was just no possible way that people could have seen that coming. Like, no way. There's too many things. Like, I now know that PS listings on a Linux machine are capped at 256 characters by default. And don't do listings there to try and figure out what's happening under the hood, because as soon as you start getting big ones, they all look the same. And like nick MAC addresses are used for random in Python and all of these obscure, weird things. Like if it's not an interview question, you shouldn't expect someone to know it. And if they
Yeah.
don't know it and they make a mistake, treat it as a learning exercise. That's, yeah.
That is a great spot to end this.
I think so.
Yeah.
No more negativity. We need like wins in the next one to offset this.
No, this was you gotta start with the war stories before we go into the victory stories, I guess.
Yeah. That was a lot of fun. Awesome.
All right, we'll end it here.